Ladies and gentlemen, I am guided that we are going to continue with our fourth speaker. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, I'm now very pleased to be able to introduce one of our Nuffield International Scholars who's been invited to present at our conference because she's been based in Europe. So I'd be delighted to introduce you all to Catherine Slack. She will explain how fisheries policy is influenced across various countries with emphasis on the role of industry associations. Her title is How the European Fishing Industry Can Make Its Voice Heard. This very topical award has been sponsored by Nuffield International Foundation Fund and Atlantis Fisheries Consulting Group. Catherine has lived in Brussels for almost 11 years, but originated from Yorkshire. She's worked in both the European Parliament on fisheries policy and also managed the European Fisheries Trade Association. And next week, she starts a new position managing the European Trade Association for Aquaculture. Catherine, the floor is yours.
Good morning. We all remember this shocker of a headline from the Telegraph a few years ago, saying that it was just 100 cod left in the North Sea. And I certainly remember this headline because I was working for the fishing sector at the time. And I remember the very aggressive public backlash against the sector. But I bet most people don't remember, hidden in the depths of the Telegraph a few days later, a correction. It was actually 21 million cod in the North Sea. Which proves the point that if you torture data long enough, it'll confess to anything. But fishermen still talk about this headline, and not the fact that it was a terrible editorial decision, but the fact that people didn't even question the figures. Was the reputation of the fishing industry so bad that people accepted, well, it could be true? And this was a real turning point for the sector because they realised something has to be done, not least because a bad image leads to really unworkable and knee-jerk policies. So I believe that fisheries trade associations can really play a lead role in turning things around. But what are the challenges that they face? First of all, it's very hard for fisheries trade associations to lobby the EU. There's 28 capitals to influence, 5 of which are landlocked, so zero interest in fisheries, and most of which are competing with each other for quota. Secondly, it's a very fragmented sector. You've got the deep sea fleet, the demersal fleet, the pelagic fleet, the tuna fleet, and they're all fishing in different sea basins of Europe, and they're all fishing with different gears. Then there's the old argument, politics versus science, where policy is based on emotion rather than fact. And finally, the extractive nature of fisheries. We don't produce anything, we just take away. So proving that we are sustainable is paramount. So you have a bad public image, hard lobbying conditions, and a fragmented voice. But I wanted to use my Nuffield to find out what trade associations can do about it. How can they connect with the consumer? How can they connect with their own members, and how they can connect with stakeholders and policymakers. So first of all, looking at how trade associations can connect with the consumer. Now, you know that to survive in today's global economy, you need to promote the idea of being an honourable merchant. That is, you're trustworthy, you're transparent, even when no one is looking, because sadly, just obeying the rules isn't enough. So fishermen should be asking themselves, what can I do better? What is my story to tell? And this is known as the social license to operate. And I learned about this concept when I was in Australia, because the fishing sector there also experienced a huge loss in their social license. And you may remember this from 18 months ago, the Supertrawler, which was actually banned from Australian waters, the monster vessel. And it caused a huge media frenzy in the press. And the fact was, people didn't like its size, it was too big. I mean, it's only big because it has freezer space and processing facilities on board, but the Australians didn't like it. So the government realised they had to do something. So they focused on achieving this social license by investing heavily in research to help the trade associations actively engage with the consumer, to open up their operations and demonstrate that what they are doing is sustainable. And now the result is they have a very high approval rating with the public. The sector is now educated on how to engage with the consumer. They know how to speak to them directly, and they can really get their message across. So this was a real success story for Australia. Now looking at how trade associations can connect with their own members. As you all know, extension services first began in the agriculture sector in the 19th century, educating farmers. But extension services were never provided to fishermen in the same way. And when the impacts of overfishing became apparent in the 1990s, it was quicker and easier for the EU to regulate rather than educate the industry. And this lack of education within the fishing sector created a vacuum that was quickly filled by certification schemes. So certification schemes being the private companies that provide fisheries improvement programs to improve the fishery and then allow the fishermen to use their logo on the fisheries product. Win-win, you might think. But what actually happened was the trade associations lost all control of the development and management of any kind of extension or education service. And now the fishing sector is heavily dependent on these logos. And in some cases, it's the only way to get their product to market. But in Alaska, the fishing sector there were fed up of paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to a private company just to seek cover from the critics. So what the trade associations did in Alaska, they teamed up with the government and they came up with an alternative label. Now this has the same internationally recognized criteria, with the added benefit of allowing them to brand it as locally sourced Alaskan. And the best bit is there's no costs for the sector. So this was an industry-led initiative by the trade associations. So as you can see, the two labels side by side, the label on the left is one that you might recognize in the supermarkets, and the one on the right is this Alaskan industry-led alternative. So both of them have internationally recognized criteria, but the one on the left, well, a third-party endorsement is only as good as their reputation. So it's not a safe bet for the industry. It's costly, and they take all the credit. Whereas the first-party industry-led label, not dependent on anyone's reputation, no costs to the sector, and they own all the positive outcomes. Now, looking at how trade associations can connect with other stakeholders. So it comes as no surprise that the fishing sector is not fond of the NGOs. They see them as a real threat to the future of fishing. And it's led to a very hostile and confrontational relationship with very little dialogue between the two. And before I did my Nuffield, I thought there's very little hope in them ever engaging. But actually, the objectives of the NGOs and the objectives of the sector are the same, to have healthy, well-managed stocks. And the two can work together with some positive results, as I saw in Canada. So I went to see the British Columbian Groundfish fishery. And this fishery was actually shut down in the 90s due to overfishing. But it was reopened a while later, and the fishing industry realized that the NGOs were still attacking them. So they thought, well, because they wanted to close the fishery permanently. So they thought, we need to do something, we need to lead the change ourselves, we need to work with the stakeholders. And so both of them sat in a room together and came up with the integrated pilot program. And this involves fishermen being 100% transparent, so they invested in their own electronic monitoring on board, and 100% accountable. So everything that's recorded on board the vessel is then audited against what they've caught in the logbook. So 100% transparency, 100% accountability. But this only worked because the trade association came together. And so not only the public can see that what they're doing is good, and the stakeholders see what they're doing is good, but they see the other fishermen next to them and what they are doing. And so everyone knows what each other is doing, and it was a real success story. Finally, looking at how trade associations can connect with policymakers. So you remember these scenes like this in the press back in the 90s, where civil society and NGO advocacy really focused on the ground or in the sea. And they would use destruction tactics. So they would destroy vessels, they would cut up nets just to get their message across. But they quickly realized that it was ineffective, it was costly, and it didn't satisfy their investors. So they shifted their focus to the source, the highest level of policy making, the international level. Because they know that policy making is a waterfall, everything trickles downwards. And often it's too late to actually find a compromise with the NGOs when it gets to the EU level, because they've already been campaigning at the highest level. And I went to Rome, to the FAO, to the Committee on Food Security, where civil society is heavily present. And I have to say, the agricultural organisations are as well, but fishermen are nowhere to be seen. Why? Well, because by nature, international fisheries policy is rarely binding. It's in the form of recommendations. So they don't see it as a priority. But this is where they're wrong, because it's important because the language used at this level eventually finds its way into the European policies. As an example, the EU have decided arbitrarily to shut off 10% of EU waters by 2020. 10%, this is huge, and this came directly from a UN resolution. And you can bet that in the next Common Fisheries Policy reform, this will come back again. So as well as being active at this international level, trade associations should also look to the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. Now, these are global objectives that every government has signed up to in 2015. They're not well known by the public, and they're definitely not taken seriously by the sector, but they affect all industries and all level of policies in the next decade. But the good news is that fishermen are already achieving these goals: food security, responsible production, and so on. So fisheries trade associations have a vital role to play here in helping their members quantify their contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals, which will instantly arm themselves with this crucial data. Because if you think about it, it's like the reverse of an impact assessment. So instead of looking at what impact a piece of policy has on your sector, you're actually instead looking at what positive measurement the sector is having on the environment or on an ecosystem. And this suddenly becomes a very powerful tool that the industry can use to tell their story. So my study has 10 recommendations, and I only had time to talk this morning about the ones in green. But the others are the promotion of shared values of their members. So where can we work together in this very fragmented organisation? Peer-to-peer learning. So what can I learn from my fellow fishermen in this very competitive environment? Leadership programs. So this is about capacity building and opening up future leaders to influential people. The extension of valuable research to their members, because there's a lot of research out there, it's just not getting to the fishermen on the ground. And finally, direct engagement with the media, who is a very powerful stakeholder in themselves. So if the industry builds long-lasting relationships with the stakeholder, they build up their leaders, and they engage more actively with the media, perhaps such erroneous headlines, such as 100 cod left in the sea, will never have taken place. So I just want to thank my sponsor, Atlantis Fisheries, Wayne Dredge for all his support, Jim Gelch from Nuffield International, and finally my boss, Richard Ashworth, for allowing me so much time out of the office, and my mum for coming all the way up to see me. So thank you very much for listening.